Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm so pleased to be here with Elyse Cherry, class of 1983. We're resuming our Zooming In series, which we started last summer in a response to COVID, and it'll probably be a part of our life heretofore going forward. So it's Pride Month, and we thought, who could we speak to who's an incredibly illustrious grad that we would celebrate the month with? And Elyse came to mind, and we worked it out with our schedules, and I'm so pleased that she's here today. So welcome, Elyse.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's so great to have you here. I am going to dive into Elyse's biography, which is fantastic, and share a little bit about her with you, and then we will dive into some questions and look forward to a conversation. Since 1997, Elyse Cherry has served as the CEO of BlueHub Capital, a national nonprofit community finance organization with a 35-year history of building healthy communities where low-income people live and work. Under Elyse's leadership, BlueHub has invested over $2.2 billion, leveraged an additional $10 billion, and built a national tax credit practice to finance affordable housing, health centers, schools, and other community facilities. It's provided foreclosure relief through the creation of a mortgage lender aimed at stabilizing urban neighborhoods, creating jobs. It's benchmark and drive down energy and utility costs, and to promote resiliency. Elyse is a former partner at the law firm of Hale and Dorr, now WilmerHale, where her national transactional practice focused on multifamily and commercial real estate finance and development, affordable housing, and open space preservation. She's an active civic and business leader, and she's a member of the Wellesley College Board of Trustees, the Board of Advisors of Eastern Bank, chair of the board of the Forsyth Institute. She's also on the board of directors of the Boston Foundation, where she co-chairs the advisory committee for the Equality Fund, a fund supporting Greater Boston nonprofits to strengthen the LGBTQ community. She's been named one of the 50 most influential Bostonians by the Boston Business Journal, one of the top 100 LGBTQ executives in the world by the Financial Times, and outstanding, and one of the 21 leaders for the 21st century by Women's E-News. In 2014, the White House named Elyse a Solar Champion of Change. I might have to hear a little bit more about that. She received Wellesley's Alumni Achievement Award in 2017, which I know is a huge deal. And she received the Susan M. Love Award from Fenway Health in 2014. In the past 7 years, the Boston Globe, the Commonwealth Institute have included BlueHub Capital as one of the top 100 women-led businesses in Massachusetts. She's a frequent speaker and panelist at national gatherings. She's been cited and published in the New York Times, the Post, the LA Times, Boston Globe, among many others. She's been on the CBS Evening News, NPR's Marketplace, PBS NewsHour, MSNBC's All In with Chris Hayes. She is a former or present member of a dozen privately held company boards, including Zipcar. She's chaired the Massachusetts Cultural Council, served on Governor DePaul Patrick's statewide transition team, and was a member of Governor Patrick's Foreclosure Impacts Task Force. She also chaired the board of Mass Equality during the trial organization's historic fight for marriage equality. She graduated from Wellesley and Newsel, obviously. She received that Wellesley Award I mentioned. She previously served on the Dean's Council for Northeastern School of Law, and she delivered the school's student commencement address, which I always like to share. So there you have it. It's quite a lot. It's very exciting, a robust career, and I'm sure there's more to come, Elyse, but wow.
Well, thanks. Thanks very much. I'm exhausted just listening to it.
That's a lot of work there. Will you tell me why you chose Northeastern University School of Law? I always like to start at the beginning.
Sure. Well, let me say first, thanks so much both for doing this for the school and for having me on. You know, it's a great joy to be participating here, and also a great frustration to be able to see class members, for example, up and down the side here, their little photos, but not to be in person. So I am very much looking forward to getting together with folks again in person and actually being able to take up our lives. But when I was thinking about law school, I applied and was accepted in a bunch of places, and was really trying to figure out whether it was possible and how it would be possible to combine the notion of law and social justice. And but at the same time, I didn't want to be pigeonholed and I didn't want to be marginalized. And so I wanted to be sure that I could also get a really strong legal education and a strong business law education, because even then I had this notion that I'm not sure I could articulate it quite as clearly, but that I really wanted to live at the intersection of all these communities of downtown and community and so forth. And so I didn't want just one or the other. And I remember actually calling at the time and trying to inquire, and God, I've lost her name, but the woman who was leading financial aid at the time said, yes, we have a very robust business law section, area, but if that's what you're interested in, perhaps you should go somewhere else. And I thought, okay, that's, so that's really what happened. And I was thrilled to be admitted, and I was thrilled with the choice. And I think, like many of us who attended Northeastern, we had a wonderful law school experience, as opposed to maybe some of our colleagues in some other places who were not quite as positive about their 3 years.
Right. I often hear people say that their law school years were the best years of their life. They made their closest friends. And then folks I know from my undergraduate institution who went to law school do not say the same thing. It was torturous. We had to read so many, books, and they didn't get the co-op experience. So it was, straight up school learning for 3 straight years. It was very competitive. So I do hear that a lot, and that's nice to hear.
Well, I think a lot of it is, I mean, you're right about cases and so forth, but so much of it was really about the culture of NUSL, right? That instead of being some cutthroat competitive culture, it was really a collaborative, supportive culture. And that alone, I think, has an enormous amount to do with all of our collective experience there.
Agree. Do you remember your co-ops, and could you describe them?
Oh, Lordy. Let me see.
Or one that had great impact, if you don't remember.
Sure. I spent a couple co-ops at Binghamdana, and I spent one with, I think it's Alan Kaufman, who actually was doing lots of research on mining manganese nodules on the floor of the South Central Pacific, and under the law of the sea conquerors. And it's interesting because I was just reading in the New Yorker recently that has finally come back around again as a, as a thing that people are worried about, both from the perspective of where do we find rare minerals, but also from the perspective of how much is actually in the deep sea that we don't know about, that we're about to upend by mining. So it was a very odd and interesting specialty, but I actually really enjoyed it with them. And then I spent one co-op, I think, with state government in the Office of the Inspector General, where I got to wander around to, tracks, right, to running tracks and take a look at the stone that was laid down. And there was a whole thing going on about where contracts had been let and so forth. So it was a wonderful combination of research and practicality and, sort of more common issues, and then these wildly abstract law of the sea issues.
Oh my goodness. The fact that you remember that just tells me so much about you also. I will share with our audience here and people who may watch this later. I think Elyse is or one of the smartest graduates that we have. Honestly, she's a Renaissance woman, and I've never seen anything like it. She knows a lot about everything. It's Pride Month, and this is such a great opportunity to talk to you about that, the LGBTQ community. I mentioned from your bio that you had worked chaired the board of Mass Equality. I want to hear a little bit about your time working on the organization's historic fight for marriage equality and some of the issues you tackled, and also just hear about what that time was like, if you could take us back to that time.
Sure. So maybe I should really take us back a little earlier than that too. when I was at Wellesley, it felt like half the campus came out, which was pretty fun, but I didn't. And I've always been of two minds about that. On the one hand, I think I missed a really fun time. On the other hand, I'm not sure I would have graduated, so maybe it wasn't so bad. So I did come out a couple of years later, and you know, the challenge in those days, we're not talking about the late 1970s. Everybody was secret, right? I mean, you'd be fired. I, at the time, was working at the National Labor Relations Board, and government policies, official government policy was that you were supposed to root out the homosexuals and fire them, right? And so this was not a period in which anybody could, you know, kind of happily come out. And I remember thinking, you know, sort of having this existential, you know, moment of existential despair when I realized that I hadn't changed anything about who I was or what I was doing or how I was living my life, and I had suddenly become criminal. I mean, because in those days, to be a lesbian, to be gay, was in fact criminalized. So, you know, it was this moment of thinking, like, how is all this going to work? You know, and so you use all these Monday morning pronouns. If folks from my era, I think, will remember that. I mean, you'd come in on Monday and somebody'd say, oh, my husband, my girlfriend, my boyfriend, my wife. And I would say, oh, we did this or we did that, because you weren't really disclosing who you were doing these things with. And so that went on, well, for a long time. And so, but then I came to Northeastern. And of course, at Northeastern, we were all out, right? And so then you go into this whole process where there's this very active lesbian, gay, now what we would call LGBTQ community, and we're all participating in that. And then I go off first to clerk and then over to Hale and Door. And of course, I have to go back in the closet because you couldn't be out. And so it really took until 1992, after Bill Clinton had gone into the White House. And I know there are lots of, you know, positives and negatives about what he did or didn't do, but the fact of the matter is, I think for lots and lots of groups that had been more marginalized, his election and the fact that he was now president really created some space. And we also were coming off a period when Bowers v. Hardwick had been decided by the Supreme Court in 1986, and lots of folks will remember this. It was a case coming out of Georgia involving private consensual sex between two men, and they were arrested for it because, as I said, of course, the whole thing was criminalized. And their position was, hey, wait a minute, you know, don't we have a right to privacy for engaging in private consensual sex? And the Supreme Court said no. And so what got clear to everybody was, part of what they were saying was, we don't know any gay people, right? And the way we were all characterized at that point was entirely negative. I mean, if folks who've gone to pride marches and so forth will know, they often see signs with people saying, you know, together 50 years, married 10, or whatever it is. And the reason for that is because in the early days, the myth of our community was nobody could stay together, nobody had real relationships. I mean, that we were all essentially a set of lowlifes. And so, you know, the court was sort of like, well, we don't know anybody. And so why would we extend rights of privacy? And so what it got clear to everybody was that we really needed to figure out how to come out. And when President Clinton came in, there was a period in which I thought I would have to refer to him as the first President Clinton, but of course we didn't go there. What's that?
No, darn it.
Right. So when he came in, you know, hundreds of thousands of people across the country came out. And that was really about 1992 or 1993. And then as we moved forward, I was by then serving on the board of GLAAD, and you know, we were all sort of trying to figure out the route and the path. And I think this is true really for every liberation movement, but the path is really a braided combination of legal strategy, organizational strategy, organizing strategy, and then social strategy, right? Really sort of trying to figure out how to change hearts and minds as well as how to change law. And so, and the thing all has to go together, right? It all has to kind of bridge together. And so, you know, I was sitting on the GLAAD board, and the issues were coming up around same-sex marriage, partly because there were folks in Hawaii who were beginning to bring cases. We were worried about the kinds of arguments they were making. And, you know, if you make bad law, it's really worse than having no law. We were worried about that. And it was also clear, you know, there were lots of us. I mean, I'd come up as a feminist, and the idea of marriage or having government in the bedroom was never anything we wanted, right? And so the notion that we were going to proceed by taking this route in terms of pursuing marriage was really something that we all had to get used to. But what got clear was the community, the LGBTQ community really, really wanted it. And they were right? I mean, what also got clear was if we were going to try and persuade the rest of the country that we were part of this bigger party politic, we had to be recognizable to people, and relationships like marriage, it turns out, make you really recognizable. So by the time we got around to 2003 and Chief Justice Marshall issued her wonderful decision in Goodrich versus, I guess, the Board of Public Health, you know, it was clear that this was going to be a really big fight, and the decision, and of course, Mary Bonato was leading this. Mary is another wonderful NUSL grad. And we were in Massachusetts because it's so hard in Massachusetts to amend the Constitution. And we knew that we were going to have a big fight about amending the Constitution here. And so, you know, it was clear there was going to be a big fight about whether this decision was going to be implemented and so forth. And so I agreed to chair first as GLAAD's representative, and then eventually more independently, although it was really all the same thing, to try and figure out how best to deal with not just the legal decision, but we actually had, I think, 17 constitutional conventions here in Massachusetts in order to assure that the legislature did not put something into place that in fact undid that wonderful decision that Chief Justice Marshall had written. So it was a very, very active time, and you know, folks came in from outside the state and so forth, but we had folks within the state, and Arlene Isaacson is somebody who comes to mind, along with Mary Bonato, who had really been here for a long time, worked for a long time. Mary, of course, in the legal system, Arlene in the legislative system, and really had the ability to understand what legislators needed and how to move them. And it was a really complex undertaking, with lots and lots of people coming out and meeting their legislators and making it clear that we were everybody's neighbors, and that we were parents and sisters and friends, and that we always had been part of everybody's neighborhood. It's just that the secrecy meant that they hadn't really known it, or perhaps hadn't had the opportunity to say what they knew. So that's what was going on. And
It was the early 90s.
Well, no, it was 2003.
Oh, okay.
The Marshall decision came out, Goodrich came out in November of 2003. And there was a 6-month period. And so it was, I think I've got this right, May of 2004, in which people could actually marry. And I actually remember being over at the Brookline Town Hall on the first day. And the town clerk was there, and the town clerk's spouse had created all these wonderful little favors for people. And the town had a little 3-piece combo, you know, and so people would come in and they'd get their licenses, and they'd go across the street to the courthouse, and there's a 3-day waiting period typically after the license, but the judge can waive it. And so the judge would waive the waiting period, and the court officer would lead everybody in applause, and they come back across. I mean, it was a really wonderful, wonderful, joy-filled time. I suspect lots of people on the call were also over in Cambridge the night that they began to issue licenses, the very first licenses ever issued in the United States on this subject. It was a very exciting time and joy-filled time, and kind of a time when all things were possible.
Well, thank you for all your work over the years
Oh,
on
it's been a privilege.
LGBTQ issues. You really have done so much for the movement here locally and beyond. And there's a big banner up in our law school that says we're the queerest law school in the country. I don't know if that's 100% factual, but we all brag about that, and say that we are, and you're definitely a pioneer there. So thank you.
Well, as I say, a privilege and a real joy.
And you're still working on issues through the foundation, is that?
Sure. You know, I think when we all started, nobody exactly understood that this was a never-ending fight, right? I mean, you sort of thought like you'd win and that would be over, and it turns out, of course, that's never the case. So I do co-chair the Equality Fund at the Boston Foundation, and part of what we're trying to do, in addition to providing annual grants to organizations large and small in the greater Boston area, is we're trying to build an endowment so that there will be an ongoing source of capital for LGBTQ issues as we go into the future. And so lots of people contribute through testamentary gifts and we're a community. Lots of us now have kids, but for a lot of folks, we don't have kids. And so we wind up without natural heirs and are looking for ways to contribute to equality, often more broadly, but sometimes within the LGBTQ community. And so the Equality Fund really provides a route for folks who want to do that.
Fantastic. I want to ask a question about one of your earlier jobs as a VISTA volunteer in rural Tennessee. How did that shape who you are today, and what did you learn from that experience?
Well, I learned lots of things. It was a wonderful experience. I was part of the East Tennessee Community Design Center, and we were working in the 16 counties of East Tennessee, doing things like trying to figure out how to bring libraries to towns and how to build out alcoholic rehab centers, and in some cases, how to provide clean water for communities that had been adversely impacted by strip mining, and people were driving 50 miles to fill jugs in order to find a clean water source. So it was a really, really, really interesting time. Vistas are also inveterate travelers, and we're all broke, but there are also vistas all over the place. So long as you had $10 in your pocket, we'd all pile into a car and go to New Orleans or Memphis or wherever there were some other vistas and go visit. And so it was this wonderful opportunity to really wander all over the South and Southeast. But in addition to the fun parts of it, I think a couple of things really became clear to me. One was I developed this incredible interest in labor and labor history, and started because the South, of course, is a place, and the Southeast is a place where there's been lots and lots of work over the years in terms of the mines and mills, and particularly women's labor history. And so we didn't have any money, but I was still buying books. I mean, that seems to have been a constant here. And so I was reading tons about labor history and going and visiting these various places. And the other thing that I came to understand was that as much as I respect and admire people for whom direct service is a calling, that it wasn't my calling, and that really what I wanted was a much broader reach. And so I started there. We did lots and lots of really direct work with communities. When I came back up to Boston, I joined the National Labor Relations Board, and the idea that sort of being part of an enforcement agency, and then realized that I actually really wanted to be broader than that too, and to really focus on policy and business. So I think that as a values matter, it's all been consistent over time. I think the challenge has been trying to figure out what route makes the most sense for any of us as individuals. I often say that the exercise of power really runs all the way from tossing rocks to a seat at the table. And you need all pieces of it, right? I'm not sitting here saying one's better than the other, but I am saying that various of us are personally better at one than the other. And that for me, I think a seat at the table is a place that I can be more effective than necessarily throwing rocks. And so the process of coming up first through Vista and then through the NLRB and then finally law school and my law firm and so forth, were really a way of kind of figuring that out over time.
Yeah, you did. You're originally from New England?
I grew up in Revere.
Okay, yeah. So the South was probably kind of eye-opening and just great to experience that at least at one point in your life and just really take all that in. But I love how you I love how you describe your progression, and it's actually a good segue to my next question, which is I want to hear a little bit about your time at Wilmer Hale, or
Sure.
Hale and Dorr, is it?
Sure. So as I say, come to Northeastern and everybody's out. And then I clerk for a year and then go to Hale and Dorr, and then nobody's out, everybody's in. And it's a pretty weird undertaking, right? You also move from, wearing, I don't know, t-shirts and jeans for 3 years to being a whole lot more dressed up. But it was actually a terrific experience. I came out of law school. I still had college debts. I had law school debts. I mean, the idea of, and I was responsible for them all. I didn't have a spouse or family or anything that was going to take on any responsibility for that. So part of what was crystal clear was that I needed to square myself up financially. And that certainly was a piece of what drove that decision. But the other piece of it was I was really, really curious about life in the belly of the beast, so to speak, right? Really to understand how power in America works. And if you join a large firm, you really are in the middle of that, right? Your clients are very large entities often. and you really have a sense about where the levers are. And actually, it was a wonderful place. We didn't have the don't ask, don't tell language then, right? I joined Hale and Dorr in 1984, and I don't think we got to don't ask, don't tell until the early 90s. But that was really what it was, right? I mean, we used to joke and say that it was a WASP law firm, and nobody asked anything about your private life, and so that was a really good thing because it was really something that you couldn't quite talk about. So, in fact, I remember. Going to the first annual dinner dance, the young associates called it the prom, and having to call somebody up and say, I'm a lesbian, I need a date, right? I mean, this was a kind of an astonishing undertaking, and we had a great time. But that's the world we were in. Everybody was really, really closeted, and you could not bring your authentic self to the office. But the fact of it is, Hale and Dorr was a place where, as a political matter, it was really pretty great. We did a ton of, in addition to doing a ton of pro bono work on the litigation side, it's one of the few firms around that actually did a ton of pro bono work on the transactional side. And I was part of the real estate finance and development area, which in those days also included environmental law. And so we represented, all kinds of community development corporations and the Trust for Public Land. And so I was able to do there a ton of pro bono work in addition to my commercial work. And part of what I discovered is that the two sides of that practice worked really, really, really well together, right? That you'd make a set of relationships on the pro bono side that were helpful on the commercial side. But the commercial side projects were so large that you had the ability there to develop approaches that then were actually really helpful on the pro bono side. And that sense of standing at that intersection, right, between the large downtown projects and affordable housing and open space projects turned out to be really useful to me personally, but also in terms of the next part of my career at BlueHub Capital.
Right. Wow. So it was formative and you learned a lot and you sort of pulled in on all these different areas, and even the pro bono work was useful to your next steps, which gets me to BlueHub and my next question, which is I want to hear a little bit about the overarching goals of your organization, how you came to found it, how you've stepped into leadership there. And just talk a little bit about your time with BlueHub and what you all are hoping to accomplish and have already accomplished.
Sure. So I was a young associate at Hale and Dorr, and some friends came to me and said, we want to start this thing called Boston Community Loan Fund. And the idea was really about aggregating capital and expertise, right? That if you're doing a project downtown and the developer blows up or the tenant blows up or whatever, there are 10 other developers waiting in the wings to pick up that project. But if you actually go out into the neighborhoods and start a project that doesn't work, you wind up with a hole in the ground for the next 30 years. And so this idea of really aggregating expertise and aggregating capital together, philanthropic capital, but a lot of debt capital, and really trying to assure that the skill sets were available to make sure that projects in the community worked as well as projects downtown was really what the early loan fund movement was about. And so, my friends came to see me, right? How does this ever happen? And, said, we want you to come join us. And I listened to all this and I thought, I don't think any of this works, right? I mean, it wasn't like I was an instant convert. I was really a skeptic. And finally they said, we had a lot of conversation. And finally they said, look, we don't really care what you think about it. You're the only one we know who's got the skill set. So you have to come join us. And I thought, oh, well, all right, on that basis, I'll go do this. So I was there, I was still at my law firm. I was on as a volunteer and as a member of the board. But what was clear to me from the very beginning is I said, if I'm going to agree to do this, I'm not going to participate in one of those things where we say, oh, we gave it a good try, but after all, we failed, right? We've really got to figure out how to make this thing work. And we've got to figure out how to be sustainable over time and scalable over time. And otherwise, I don't think any of us should be wasting our time. And so we all agreed to do that right from the very beginning. And we started to put together transactions. We hired our first staff member, Dick Jones, who's actually still with us 35 years later. We've been colleagues forever, and began to look at transactions. And what was crystal clear, we were borrowing lots of the money to do this from high net worth individuals, but also, often from the nuns, right? it's one thing. I mean, you never want to lose anybody's money, but the nuns were giving us their breakfast money. And so you really didn't want to lose their money. And so we were clear from the beginning that we had to have a set of underwriting criteria and policies and so forth to really assure that we were making good loans. And I'll never forget, our first loan was for a grand total of $7,500. Well, we had started, we only had $3,500. I mean, it was absurd. We didn't have enough gray hair to know you couldn't do anything with that. And
Sometimes
we took
that's best.
What's that?
Sometimes that's best. You don't know you can't do something.
I guess it is. Although I've certainly developed a lot of gray hair over the years trying to make it work. We did a loan for $7,500 for Tent City, and we took $100,000 guarantee from one of our high net worth lenders. But it was really important to kind of dive in and get our feet wet, and because we were also clear that we were going to be an organization that learned by doing as opposed to learned by theory, right? And it was just crystal clear to us that you can sit around and pontificate about all kinds of stuff, but I never had any patience for that. And anyway, you don't really learn anything. I see Jeremy on here saying that's the Northeastern approach. You're absolutely right. I suspect that's where I learned it. And so that's what we did. And so we started out, and I continued to be downtown. I eventually, during the downturn of 1992, left Hale and Dorr and moved over to the Plymouth Rock family of insurance companies, where I sort of moved to the business side, leading their whole insurance services effort and IT, about which I knew almost nothing, and a variety of things like that.
Oh my God.
Eventually we hit about $30 million in terms of loans out the door, and we're really trying to figure out what to do next. And the message kind of was, listen, you thought this up, you put this stuff into place, you have to come lead it. And I kept saying, no, I make my money downtown, right? This is what I do. I mean, I always had this sense of there's some things you get paid for and some things you don't. If you get up early and go to bed late, you can get them all done. And I never much distinguished, but I was fairly clear that I made my money downtown. But I was dead wrong, and I got persuaded to come over, and in fact, it's the most interesting, rewarding, challenging work I've ever done. And we have moved from that $30 million point, which was back in 1997, on a single business line, to over the years, we've developed about a half dozen business lines. And as Mielle said earlier, we've actually managed to push better than $2 billion out the door, and to leverage actually now better than 10. So, at some point, the numbers actually start meaning something. We've moved from being a Boston-based organization to being a national-based organization, and it's been really interesting. I mean, just fabulously interesting, and partly because what I was saying earlier about all of those techniques that we developed in large law firms to make lots of money for middle class and wealthy folks, we actually put to work in the service of low income people in communities. And so, you can sit there and be developing capital structures, and you kind of look at them, you think, what's wrong with this picture? There aren't enough zeros ahead of a decimal point, right? Which is why most of the rest of the world doesn't focus on them. But in fact, those structures really do create wealth. And if you put them to work in the service of communities that need those structures, you can have a big impact.
Well, you're amazing, and the work you're doing is so needed, and it's sort of newsel brought to light on a really big scale. So it's fun to hear about. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about your commitment to gender equality. I know you went to Wellesley, and that must have impacted you in some way, and you've spoken for me at Women in the Law more than once, but could you just talk about, I love that you're one of the top 100 women-led businesses in Massachusetts. Could you talk about your commitment to female power a little bit?
Sure. It's funny. I mean, commitment sounds like it's something outside of me, when in fact it's absolutely core to my being, right? So, and I think always really has been. I mean, the idea growing up that there were things that you couldn't do or weren't supposed to do because you were a girl. I mean, even as an 8-year-old, it didn't sit right. I mean, I never understood why my brother could be out later, or why he could ride a bike before I could, or any of those things. It just seemed absurd. And, and that continued. And of course, I came of age as the feminist movement was emerging. And that was a really, really wonderful thing, both from the perspective of the various ideas that were emerging and the organizing that was happening, but also, when I first started taking what we then call, I guess we still call women's studies classes at Wellesley, it was really the very beginning of all that. And so I kind of came right up that movement. But the thing I would say is, you're absolutely right. Commitment to gender equality, commitment to LGBTQ equality, but a commitment to equality is not, from my perspective, something that's bifurcated in that way. I mean, the idea always was all boats in a rising tide. And so whether it's gender or gender identity or sexual orientation or color or national origin or any of the ways in which others try to divide us, all of it's got to work together. Right. And we've all really got to come up and we're never benefited, if you ask me, by fighting with each other. Right. I mean, I have never been of the view. I mean, there's a one of the great dividing principles are folks who think there's a pie that's a given size and you're fighting for a bigger share of it. And then the rest of us who sort of think, no, you just make the pie bigger. Right. Which has kind of always been my view of the world. And so the goal really is to be sure that that everybody gets to play and understanding that that is not just because we all want to live authentic, full lives with all of the benefits that everyone else shares, but because the rest of the world needs us too, right? I mean, I sometimes joke and say, I know we'll have achieved full equality when we're hiring mediocre lesbians, if there is such a thing, right? I mean, so today, what you endlessly hear is, oh, well, we need to hire excellence, but you mostly hear it for folks who are part of communities that are trying to achieve true equality. So I think that all of us have a tremendous amount to add from an emotional perspective, an intellectual perspective, a thought perspective, a vision perspective. I sometimes talk about languages in this context, that if you're part of the dominant group, you kind of speak a language and it doesn't necessarily occur to you that anybody speaks any different language. But if you're not part of the dominant group, if you're a woman, or in my case, a lesbian, you kind of begin to realize pretty soon that the language you speak and the language maybe your white male legal or financial colleagues speak isn't exactly the same, right? And so you start to understand their language so that you can communicate with them in it, because it helps you get your own ideas across. But then you begin to realize that if I'm speaking a different language, maybe other people are speaking different languages too. And then you become much more attuned to the languages that people speak, right? And then you get to live this really wonderful life in which you've got a foot in many worlds, and you have the advantage of knowing all these different kinds of people who bring different ideas about how to live and how to be. And I'm a cook, and they were wonderful cooking ideas and food ideas and travel ideas. And so it's a way to lead this much broader life. So I just feel as though the more we can build out a world that includes all of us, the better world it is. I mean, that just seems to me to be a given. So it's sometimes hard to understand an argument that's contrary to that.
I love your perspective. We should have a bigger piece of pie. Bigger pie.
Absolutely. Bigger pie.
That's the way to go. Yeah. I wanted to ask, what is left for you on your list, your bucket list of things to do and accomplish? What else would you like to do?
Oh, it's an interesting question. I don't know that I have an absolute answer to that, because that suggests there's an end, right? Which I'm not sure I'm quite willing to acknowledge either. But I'll tell you some of what we're currently working on. Well, in a couple of different arenas. As you mentioned, I chair the board of the Forsyth Institute, and it's actually a world-renowned microbiology institute, which is known in some ways more internationally than it is here. And you might ask why it is that a political science major and a lawyer is chairing the board of a microbiology institute, which is actually focused on the oral biome. That's all of the stuff that grows in our mouths, and the relationship of all of that to systemic health. And the reason is because the business model for institutes like the Forsyth has been changing, right? That for a long time, it really depended on NIH grants and similar sources of revenue. And now we really have to expand those sources of revenue. And that, of course, it turns out is something I do know something about. So part of what we're doing is, when I think about my work over the next years, it really is about helping the Forsyth build out its whole business model so that it goes on as the wonderful institution it is. Forsyth is a fabulous place. It's the place that first developed fluoride treatment. It's actually the place that developed the idea of dental assistants and so forth to expand out the notion of clean teeth. We do lots of work on Forsyth Kids, providing dental services for kids in the public schools. So it's this fabulous place, and being certain that it sits on a really firm financial bottom is part of what I can do to help. So that goes on. At BlueHub, we are expanding our lending to more and more areas across the country. We're in Texas and Memphis and all through the New York and California, all through the Northeast and mid-Atlantic states. But now we're also moving down into the Delta area too. And so there's lots of work that's going on there. And my favorite new project at the moment is we're working on something that we call 1% for America. And we developed this idea actually when Hillary was running, and she was talking about a path to citizenship for folks who are undocumented in the first 100 days. And I was walking around Brookline, as is my habit. It appears that as I have aged, I'm even less able to sit still than I used to be. And so I was walking around thinking about things. And what I was thinking about was, that she would announce a path on day one, and on day two, every predator would be out of the woodwork saying, we'd be delighted to lend you the money for the fees, but after all, you're undocumented and you don't have a credit history, and so for you, it's 20%. And part of the frustration for me of being a part of the nonprofit world is that we are so often in the position of cleanup, right? Somebody has come and created some product that's created a real problem, and then the nonprofit world cleans up. And so I was really kind of thinking about, isn't there a way we can get out ahead of this? And so we developed this idea of 1% for America, which was really a way of providing really low cost loans to folks to cover the cost of application to citizenship, essentially 1% loans. And then we all know where that election went. And I had set aside time to do this, which I no longer needed. I went off and went hiking in New Zealand for a while and came back and said, well, what got clear to me as I kind of hiked up and down, every mountain in New Zealand we could find, was that we might not have a solution, but we still had 11 million undocumented people here, and ultimately that was going to need to be solved. So once the President Biden came in, we really resurrected this in the earliest stages, not to deal with the undocumented population, since of course there's no path yet, but to really get set up so that we can deal with folks who are documented and really try and drive down the cost of financing a path to citizenship. And so we're essentially building out a digital marketing effort and really trying to create a very large community that I'm hoping in the end will be measured in millions, that includes not just immigrants looking for a cheaper way to finance a path to citizenship, but all of the 75% of the country that actually supports a path to citizenship, and really to encourage folks, small dollar lenders from across the country, to join us and to build out a community that maybe in the end can have a positive impact on this conversation. So, I say sometimes there are a variety of things in our DNA at BlueHub Capital. We understand capital and how to invest and lend into lower income communities, into lower income people. We understand capital structures. We don't know anything about digital marketing. And so we have been learning that, and we actually have just hired folks to begin to really lead that effort for us. So it's a really, really interesting time at the organization as we add a set of skills to what we already know in order to tackle this new undertaking. So we'll see. I often say that every day is a new chance to fall on your face, and maybe that this is the time we do, but that's where we're going, or we're trying to go anyway.
Wow. I told you all Elyse was a Renaissance woman. Everything from oral hygiene to biomes to immigration to LGBTQ issues. You're absolutely incredible. This conversation has taken us so many places, and it's just been such a joy and a pleasure. I wanted to ask before we go, is there anything else that you want to share with our audience that you think they should know? And maybe if you were talking to someone that wasn't out yet, is there anything you would say to them?
Well, on the coming out part, I think I would say find your community and find your courage, right? And I think that there are lots and lots of communities now. People still have trouble with family and friends and so forth, but I think that the positive impact you can have is by coming out in a positive way, right? That if in fact you express your anxiety and so forth, you often give other people some permission to be more negative than if you feel pretty good about it. So I would really encourage folks to find a community to feel good themselves, and then to come out and join the rest of us. It's kind of great out here. But I guess the other thing that I would say is, I will say that I have been pretty worried over the last few years about where we're going. The combination of a Trump presidency, what happened on January 6th, the emerging movement that really got jump-started with George Floyd's murder last spring. And so part of my reaction to that has really been to go diving into history and to really try and understand where we are in our own historical context. And because the pandemic's been on, there's been some time to do that. And so I've been reading some wonderful things. Kelly Bates Jackson on Force and Freedom, which is it really is an account of the role that African Americans played in the abolitionist movement, which is a fabulous book. Heather Cox Richardson on how the South won the Civil War. Jill Lepore and These Truths. And I've actually just gone into Akil Reed Aman's book, The Words That Made Us, which is really a gigantic tome on the emergence of the Constitution. And I find myself thinking a lot about not how would we tweak the Constitution we have. And this is a theoretical undertaking. I'm not suggesting anything otherwise. But if I were to start from scratch, how would we create a constitution that not only guaranteed the kinds of broad participation and rights that we think are important in terms of healthcare and food and housing, education, the ability to advance and to build a better life and so forth, but also that changed the relationship between business and government so that we had an economy that encouraged innovation, encouraged productivity, but didn't necessarily encourage oligarchy. And so I've been thinking a whole lot about that, and would love to have everybody else join me in thinking about that, because I think that in the end, we have all got to think carefully about how to build something out here that is not binary. I think there's an awful lot of conversation today that it's kind of an either or conversation, and we leave too many people out. But I also think that there is a fundamental divide in the country that has been here since before our founding in terms of really what we stand for. Do we stand for broad-based democracy, or do we stand for property rights and a much narrower view of who controls? And so I don't think it's an issue if we don't understand each other. I think we understand each other perfectly well. I think it's an issue that there are two radically different philosophies that have been fighting since the beginning. And I will say that this period feels to me way too much like the 1850s for comfort. And so I'm thinking a lot about, what could a future look like that we could all sign on to. So anyway, I would just encourage everybody else to come and think about it too.
Love that. Maybe you'll run for office.
No, I don't think so.
Well, Elyse, this has been an absolute joy and pleasure. I'm so appreciative of you giving some time to us today and sharing your thoughts about many, many different topics and perspectives, for being so open and being just a wonderful example of a graduate of Northeastern Law School. I've appreciated your personal support for me over the years, and I just love what you've done for the school and all the support that you've given us. So thank you for being with us today, being a part of Zooming in and spending some time talking to me.
Well, thanks so much. It's been a great pleasure. And Northeastern, is not just a wonderful part of my past, but really a formative part of my present and future. And it was a terrific joy to be there. And thanks to everybody for coming. And again, I'm looking forward to seeing you in person at some point.
It will happen. Thank you for staying involved with the school. And thank you today. If everyone would give a nice round of applause.
Oh, thanks.
You did, but thank you, Elyse. I'll talk
Sure
to you
thing.
soon. Appreciate
Take
your
care.
time. All right.
Bye-bye.
You too.